Happy President's Day, y'all. I'm going to make a belated post based off of my blog about President's Day from a couple of years back. This is the day we celebrate the leadership, or lack thereof, that has been so instrumental in making us the nation we are today. In order to celebrate, I thought I'd list my 6 favorite presidents, my personal reasons why they are my favorites, and some random thoughts on the kind of president we need today. Number 6 is John F. Kennedy. As a 12-year-old, I might have listed him 4th or 5th, but then all I really knew was that he had made great speeches, faced down the Soviets, and challenged America to go to the moon. The geek in me will always love him, if only for the lunar landing challenge. My favorite words of his that at least pertain to this post at the moment: we have the power to make this the best generation of mankind in the history of the world, or make it the last. Number 5 is Ronald Reagan. He was the president through most of my teenage years, from the time I was 9 till I was 17. I remember well the deep malaise of the 70s, and Reagan was the voice of hope. Democrats likely see it differently, and that is okay. Some of their complaints about him are legitimate. He made some pretty profound mistakes. But his eloquence stirred us, made us proud to be Americans again, when the years before had taught us to be ashamed of being Americans. He stayed strong to his principles, yet he still called the Democrats our friends across the aisle, and without irony. He knew that the average Democrat loved America too. They just had a different perspective. He wasn't into the demonizing and villainizing that had become the name of the game today. And I can never forget his speech to Gorbachev, "Tear down this wall." I never thought I'd outlive the Cold War. I fully expected to spend my last days on Earth coughing out my last breaths in agony from a nuclear war. But I think few will argue that at least a part of the Cold War ending was Reagan's strength of character and his willingness to stick to his principles, even in the face of sometimes harsh and frankly sometimes merited criticism. My favorite lines of his of all time, one of the first political speeches I ever remember hearing, in 1976, he recognized his defeat in the election to Gerald Ford, talking about a letter he was writing for a time capsule that would be opened in 2076. And suddenly it dawned on me, those who would read this letter 100 years from now will know whether those missiles were fired. They will know whether we met our challenge. Whether they have the freedoms that we have known up until now will depend on what we do here. Will they look back with appreciation and say, thank God for those people in 1976 who headed off that loss of freedom, who kept us now 100 years later free, who kept our world from nuclear annihilation? And if we fail, they probably won't get to read the letter at all, because it spoke of individual freedom. They won't be allowed to talk of that or read of it. I've always thought of that speech. I'll be honest, I've thought of it more and more over the last 7 or 8 years. Number 4 was a hard choice for me, but I decided on Teddy Roosevelt. Likely this will seem a logical contradiction of my basic belief that government intervention is usually, at best, bungling, and at worst, tyrannical. While I'm largely a capitalist, I'm no laissez-faire capitalist. I do believe some government regulation is necessary. The crux of the argument is how much is necessary, and have we overreached that necessity in some cases? There are three reasons I place him so highly in my esteem. First, he led us into becoming a world power. Before him, the talk was always someday in the future when America is a great power. I remember hearing that in so many books from the Victorian times. During his presidency, we entered the present tense. We still weren't the superpower, but we had become a superpower. His presidency gave credibility to the progressive movement. Arguably, it has gone quite a long ways from Roosevelt today, but at the time it was badly needed to improve the lives of average citizens, in my humble opinion. He was not afraid to stand up to big business on our behalf. My great-grandfather's brother died of botulism from badly packed sardines. Had he eaten that 10 years later under the Roosevelt administration, possibly that tragedy could have been averted. He strengthened our Navy. He spearheaded the Panama Canal project. He negotiated peace between Russia and Japan, becoming the first president to win a Nobel Prize. And finally, the teddy bear. We wouldn't have Winnie the Pooh if it weren't for Teddy Roosevelt. My all-time favorite words of his, if you will bear with me, it is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of a high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. My third favorite president is Abraham Lincoln. This is controversial to some. I know some people that I respect very highly who would disagree with me about this, and I respect their view. The reasons I love him as a president: number one, he was so different from the average politician, especially when you compare him to the politicians of these dark days. He had a humility that you just don't see in these times, and barely saw back then. Could you imagine Trump leading the country through the Civil War? I'm going to tell you, we're going to have to send the biggest cannon. I tell you, these are the most incredible cannons ever made. My stovetop hat is the biggest. Look, nobody in Washington has a bigger stovetop hat. The Southerners, we love them, especially the uneducated ones. But if they try to shoot my stovetop hat, then we'll send the mother of all bombs, and we will secure the airfields of the continental airports. I do not have tiny hands. I can attest from personal experience that the world hates humility. But like Christ, Socrates, and Washington, Lincoln actually found a way to be humble and yet make it work. Second, he did his level-headed best. He started the war knowing virtually nothing about modern warfare. Carl Sandburg documents his own journalistic passage with the president. At the beginning of the war, he felt the man was a hack and a clown. By the end of the war, he felt like he was in the midst of a hero. And Lincoln's assassination affected him with the same haunting sorrow we usually reserve for the loss of spouses or children. The nation, even some in the South, felt an outpouring of grief like we had never felt before, and it wouldn't again until the death of Kennedy. Last of all, his personal spiritual journey, especially as it pertains to the freeing of the slaves. He was always a Christian, but in his last years, an entirely unique set of catastrophes no president before or since has had to face. He deepened his spirituality, seeking answers not just from military or economic might, but from an Almighty who he felt was offended by the sins of the nation, and few national sins compared with slavery. To say that we based our beliefs on Christian charity and the dignified freedom of all was a cruel mockery in the face of slaves whipped, dehumanized, worked to death, raped, bred like animals, owned like cattle. People criticized him for not knowing, not believing this before. Let's be a little bit fair here. How many of us spend more than a token word about the child sweatshops of Nike? How many have even written a letter to Amazon or Walmart to protest their inhumane treatment of workers, of which I have personal experience, so please don't try to tell me it doesn't happen. Yet we want to get on to this man because it took a civil war to awaken him. How many of us will never awaken, even though the prophets came back from the dead to tell us the truth? My favorite words of Lincoln's are from the last of his second inaugural address. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still must it be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. My second favorite was George Washington. What can I possibly say about Washington that has not already been said? I had an ancestor serving at Valley Forge under Washington, a Sergeant Pope. While it is very likely that Washington wouldn't have known the man from Adam, I have no idea, I can't help but feel pride that the same blood flows in my veins that froze and suffered and struggled and fought so we could be free. Washington is known as the father of our country. He led us as commander-in-chief in one of the most difficult struggles we have ever had, against impossible odds, leading a ragtag army of largely untrained volunteers against the greatest superpower of the day. Washington actually won. Then he led the convention that forged our Constitution, then was elected twice as our first president, and the only one that has ever received unanimous votes from all of the electors. He could have been King of America, but he chose instead to help forge a government based on democratic Republican premises of liberty. I wonder if we will ever see his like again, or is it possible for his like to rise to the top in this corrupt and derelict age? My favorite words of his: the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The last one, unless you personally know me very well, will probably come as a surprise to everyone who listens to this. Thank you for listening to the end, but my top pick for the best president we have ever had, in my humble opinion, was James Monroe. I know it sounds strange, and frankly, until I read a biography about him a few years back by Harlow Giles Unger called The Last Founding Father, all I really knew about him was he was the dude who originated the Monroe Doctrine, man. But he also fought personally under George Washington in the Revolution, just like my ancestor. He is in the painting Washington Crossing the Delaware. He's the man holding the flag. And in the famous painting Capture of the Hessians at Trenton, he is the wounded man laying in agony behind victorious Washington and other commanding officers. The man took a bullet to his lungs for our liberty, and yet he was so tough as nails, he recovered. I learned about his amazing career, in which he had the greatest variety of posts of any man that has ever served as president. I learned how he was instrumental in acquiring the Louisiana Purchase. I knew a little bit about that. He led the Rescue Fire Brigade and some of the few troops to actually fire back on the British when they burned Washington, D.C. in the War of 1812. While the commander in charge of the troops at the time could not rally anyone, Monroe actually could and did. He was one of the few government figures, but he was one of the few who could put up any competent action. He rallied a stand that cemented his fame as a hero and led the efforts to repair the damage to the city and to feed the refugees. Monroe became our idol, and he was elected in the second biggest landslide in presidential history. Both terms he served, he was one vote shy of a unanimous election. And that was only because both times an elector felt that only Washington should ever have that victory. He was the last American president, other than Washington, the only man to ever run unopposed. He spearheaded and signed. Now, we live in pretty dark times, and none of these folks are alive to help us. We need the leadership of a Washington, a Lincoln, a Monroe. We have crises that only such people could lead us through. And I'm not so sure we even have the leadership to deal with a candy bar theft. We need the honesty of Washington, the bravery of Monroe, the humility of Lincoln, the industriousness of Roosevelt, the communication of Reagan, the vision of Kennedy. Instead, we have cowards who are full of themselves, who don't have any vision or know how to communicate it. Without a vision, the people perish. Welcome to the apocalypse in the land of confusion. We need the corrupt talking heads to fall and a hero to take their place. Thanks for listening.